You're listening to Eating for Eden, episode 36. When it comes to doing something about climate change, your food choices matter. Thanks for tuning in to Eating for Eden, a podcast that takes a food-first approach to climate action. I'm your host, Jessica J. Schroeder, and I am passionate about food that tastes good and does good. I'll guide you with practical tips and help you thoroughly enjoy your food along the way. As 2024 draws to a close, I thought it would be a good idea to highlight some of the best content from this past year. 2024 was an exciting year for Eating for Eden. I launched the podcast on Earth Day, April 22nd, and published new content every week, bringing us to our 36th episode today. In addition to foundational content in the early weeks, I hosted several guests for in-depth interviews, shared stories and examples from my own experience, walked through a few recipes, and provided lots of practical tips to help you take what you're learning and put it into action. Whether you've listened to just a handful of episodes this year, or if you've listened to them all, I'd love to hear what most resonated with you this year. Shoot me a message at edenandme@substack.com to let me know what kind of content you want to hear more of in the new year. Your input really matters to me. Thank you so much for listening. If you've been enjoying this podcast, please take a minute or two to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. I'm hoping to grow the reach of this podcast in 2025, and your kind words play an important role in that process. Also, share this episode or your favorite past episode with a friend. Spreading the word through you, my dear listeners, is the best way to help more and more people consider this important topic and begin to take action as well. In foundational episodes such as 1, 3, and 4, we explored how food is related to the current climate crisis and how we can begin making meaningful shifts in our own food choices. Core to these episodes were a blend of information and application, providing opportunities for you to learn and equipping you to make a difference in your life day to day. These episodes covered the most important facts guiding us to plant-predominant or even plant-exclusive eating, along with practical steps for getting started wherever you happen to be in your own food journey. From episode 1, Food, Climate Problem and Solution, let's look at how food is part of the climate crisis. There are multiple ways that food is part of the problem. Some have to do with how food is grown, raised, and produced. Others have to do with food waste. From a 30,000-foot view, food in general accounts for about 26% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. That's a full quarter. Food. Most of those emissions, 77%, are from the food we eat, and the other 23% is due to food waste and loss. That means that there are things that we can do both about the food we eat and what doesn't get eaten in order to reduce our carbon footprint. Zooming in, let's get more specific about how food is part of the problem. And again, a whopping 26% of the problem. By far, the largest contribution food is making to climate change is methane production and release. This comes from several sources, but the biggest offender is livestock, especially cows. According to the Carbon Almanac, of the total emissions from food production, about 61% are due to livestock raised for meat and dairy. Let that sink in for a moment. Of all the kinds of food on offer at grocery stores and restaurants alike, well over half of food-based emissions come from just these two animal-based categories, meat and dairy. Another contributor is food waste, rotting in landfills. While many of us may expect that rotting food can just become compost and return to the soil, this doesn't happen in an environment where food waste is surrounded by plastic rather than organic matter. So instead of turning into compost and nourishing the ground, food waste in a landfill just sits there rotting, emitting harmful methane gas. I keep talking about methane. What's the big deal, you may be asking? I thought CO2 was the problem. Yes, and greenhouse gases are the problem. Methane is a powerful greenhouse gas. Like CO2, it traps heat from the sun, causing the sun's rays to warm the planet. And although methane doesn't stick around in the atmosphere for as long as CO2 does, methane's heat-trapping potential is 84 times that of CO2 over a span of 20 years. So in a time when imminent action is needed to prevent irreversible planetary impact, tackling major methane emitters can make a huge dent in helping achieve the crucial Paris Agreement targets for limits on global warming. Yes, CO2 will stick around longer, so we still need to take action to reduce our CO2 emissions, but cutting down on methane in a big way right now will help to avoid a speedier rate of warming. This is important because climate change impacts often work as a vicious cycle. The impacts of warming have consequences that in turn make climate change worse, and on it goes. Slowing warming now, by reducing methane emissions now, is an important step to take, and it's one we can take quite easily by attending to our food choices. Again, methane is emitted both during food production and through food waste rotting in landfills. With this in mind, we can implement solutions both at the front end and at the back end of the food system and our involvement in it. Before getting to those solutions, let's consider two other ways food is part of the problem. After methane production, other major food-related contributors to climate change include deforestation and land use. These two go hand in hand. As more land is required to either graze animals or grow food to feed them in feedlots, more forests are being cleared to make this possible. And did you notice that either or? Land is needed for raising livestock for food, regardless of whether it is commercial or grass-fed. Our World in Data states that 60%, that's 60%, of tropical deforestation is due to beef, soy, and palm oil production. And before anyone rails against tofu, let me clarify that 77% of global soy is fed to livestock. Only 7% of total global soy is used for direct human consumption in products like tofu, tempeh, soy milk, and edamame. Trees are not being cut down to feed the vegans, people. Okay, so land is cleared to graze more cattle who belch out tons of methane. That much is clear. Or to grow crops to feed livestock that are not being grazed. Or to produce palm oil to stuff into ultra-processed foods and other household products. While seeing rainforests cut down is obviously a tragic thing, what does the loss of trees in itself have to do with greenhouse gas emissions? Remember learning as a kid that we, as humans, breathe in oxygen and plants breathe in CO2? Plants, trees especially, draw down carbon out of the atmosphere and store it. We call these carbon sinks. Whenever forests are destroyed, huge amounts of greenhouse gases are emitted. So not only are the practices that deforestation is making way for emitting more greenhouse gases, the very act of deforestation itself is a huge emitter. From episode 3, What You Eat versus Where It Comes From. When it comes to eating for climate change, how much does local actually matter? A lot? A little? Somewhere in between? To answer this question, we need to consider the level of impact transportation has on a food's overall footprint. It's one thing to take a, quote, common sense approach to something like this, assuming something must be the case. It's another thing to put it under the microscope, so to speak, and examine it through scientific data. Dr. Hannah Ritchie, a researcher at Our World in Data, claims that the charge to, quote, eat local is one of the most misguided pieces of advice. She goes on to clarify, saying, eating locally would only have a significant impact if transport was responsible for a large share of food's final carbon footprint. For most foods, this is not the case. To be clear, she's not saying that eating local makes no difference at all. Rather, she's emphasizing the size of the difference. This may surprise you. It certainly surprised me to learn this, but the transportation of a given food typically only accounts for less than 10% of its total carbon footprint. And it's far less than 10% for some of the biggest emitters, as we'll get to in a minute. The vast majority of a food's climate impact has to do with the various other factors specific to the food item itself, such as land use change and farming practices. Additional potential factors aside from transport include animal feed, processing, retail, and packaging. According to an article by Dr. Ritchie on this very topic, combined land use and farm stage emissions account for more than 80% of the footprint for most foods. Comparatively, she adds, transport is a small contributor to emissions. For most food products, it accounts for less than 10%. Dr. Ritchie further states, it's much smaller for the largest greenhouse gas emitters. In beef from beef herds, it's 0.5%. Taking beef from beef herds as an example then, if only 0.5% comes from transportation, then 99.5% of emissions from beef are caused by other factors, most notably farm stage emissions followed by land use change. If transportation only accounts for 0.5% of beef's emissions, does choosing local beef really make much of a difference? I realize that there are other values at play as well when considering whether to eat local. Supporting local is about relationships in the community, the local economy, and more. But from an environmental point of view, waving the local flag, so to speak, can be a bit of a distraction. Based on the science, eating locally has a relatively small impact compared to other steps we might take. So, what would make a bigger impact? What can we do to lessen the other 90 to 99% of our food's emissions? Dr. Ritchie's conclusion is that it matters far more what we choose to eat than where that food comes from. From episode 4, Taste is Habit. I've heard it said that it's easier to change a man's religion than his diet. I agree, and I don't. I agree in the sense that I understand this meaning. We human beings have a vice grip on a handful of things in life. Typically, these are politics, religion, and our food preferences, in that ascending order. I also agree in the sense that someone else cannot change a person's diet. Just like in religion or politics, or any other sphere for that matter, a person must decide for herself that she wants to change. Only then are such mountains to be moved. Yet, this mountain may be more of a sand dune. This is where I disagree. I disagree with the near impossible difficulty communicated in this statement because diet, while indeed deeply seated and complexly storied, is far more easily changed than we may think. Why? Because taste is habit. Full stop. Taste is habit. Setting politics and religion aside, what we eat is largely a matter of preference formed over time by a series of choices. We form habits from those choices, and preferring convenience, ease, and hits of dopamine, we choose the same things time and again. But we don't have to. I mentioned earlier that I used to think I'd die if I ever found out I'd developed a lactose intolerance. Give up dairy? Not today. Not ever. Or so I thought. Now, to keep myself honest, I'm technically not dairy-free. I do enjoy a croissant from time to time, or a slice of Roman-style pizza from the best bakery on the planet, but these are occasional, intentional indulgences. And the dairy I choose to eat must be out of this world worth it. But hang on, how did I go from being afraid of needing to give up cheese to actively avoiding it, as well as ice cream, cow's milk, and butter, and without much of a problem? In short, I changed my habits. I'm not saying this was easy, and it certainly didn't happen overnight, but it did happen. I made little changes over time that, over several years, amounted to massive changes. Little steps, if we keep taking them, turn into leaps and bounds. And that's the case for good or ill. That's right. Taste is habit. Let me give you an idea of how my tastes have changed over time. In high school and college, some of my favorite foods included bacon, Greek yogurt, ice cream, cheesecake, lamb, Romano cheese, sushi, blue cheese, calzones, butter-laden pumpkin breads and pound cakes, and the list goes on. Now, my favorite foods include avocado, kale, sourdough bread, homemade chickpea hummus, arugula, tofu-based feta, homegrown tomatoes, lettuce wraps made with tempeh, royal corona beans, oats, pistachios, and more. Not to say that I didn't eat any of my now favorite foods earlier, but they were more or less things I ate because I knew they were good for me and liked them well enough. But if it came as a choice between the first and the second list, if it came down to pure taste and not an Epicurean, what will my future self think, I'd probably have opted for the things on the first list. Here's another example. I have always loved peanut butter, but the first time I tried natural peanut butter, I was confused and probably not a little bit disgusted. I was a Jiffy girl. As a kid, when I got home from school, I would get a huge spoonful of Jiffy, sit on the couch, and slowly suck on that trans fat and sugar-laden spoon while watching cartoons. Now, I'm buying organic, creamy Valencia peanut butter, just peanuts and salt, and I can't get enough. Today, if I even get presented with decent quality, trans fat-free peanut butters that contain any sugar or palm oil added, I'm offended. My taste buds have completely shifted. Night and day. Yeah, I know it's just peanut butter, but come on, you know it's a big deal. Anyone who's ever had arguments with a spouse about whole wheat pasta will understand. The takeaway here? It takes time for our taste buds to adapt. But oh, can they ever. Some of the most downloaded episodes, and definitely the most fun for me to produce, were the guest episodes from this year. Let's dive back into episodes 9, 16, 20, and 35 for the conversation highlights with our 2024 guests. Episode 9 welcomed our first guest to the show, retired earth scientist turned YouTuber Chris McCaskill. In addition to his journey of rubbing shoulders with the like of Jack LaLanne and Steve Jobs, Chris and I discussed the impact of beef, the power of being a reducer when it comes to meat consumption, and the prevalence of misinformation in the media today.
Well, so that's a good question. I just feel like plant-dominant diets, it doesn't really matter to me if it's vegan, vegetarian, Mediterranean, Asian, what it is, as long as it's plant-dominant. Plant-based companies who sell plant-oriented foods, Impossible, Beyond, and any number of others, their executives know that it's the reducers that have the big impact on the planet and on human health. It's not the people at the very pointy end of the plane, the vegans and the vegetarians, because they represent a small amount of the population. The larger part of the population are the people who are reducing. They're going for meatless Mondays, or maybe only having meat after, for dinner, but not for lunch and breakfast and so on. That's where the big gains are. And being an earth scientist, I like to keep up with the latest thinking from earth science. And Hannah Ritchie is a PhD environmental scientist. Yeah,
she's great. Her new book. Yeah.
And, it's a great book. I don't know if you've started reading it yet, but she takes a very positive, optimistic view on we can be the first generation to actually stop climate change. Some earth scientists push back on her a little bit, saying that's a little optimistic, Hannah. But I like it. But one of the things she points out in there, we're not going to get people to stop eating meat. It's too attractive and it has social status and everything else associated with it, masculinity, all the marketing in the beef industry. But we are becoming successful at getting them to reduce. And that's where, the big action is. So, I happen to be vegan, and I've been vegan for a very long time, but that's because I'm an earth scientist, and we earth scientists are freaked out about what's happening to the earth. That's a whole nother story. I don't know any earth scientists like Hannah Ritchie who aren't vegan. We just seem to see what no one else sees. We're out in the field and we see it. We see the data. And I just don't think anybody else wants to see it, or, their lives are still comfortable. I don't know what it is. We, earth scientists, we're just baffled. We don't know why it is.
Yeah, we hear what we want to hear, and then we reject what we don't want to hear, unfortunately.
we can't understand. And my own generation, my second son told me at dinner the other day, we have to wait for the boomers to die to make progress on this. And it's like, but wait, we're the ones who were doing all the protests in the late 60s and 70s. We got the EPA started. We pressured Nixon into establishing the EPA. We saved the Columbia River Basin. We saved Lake Erie from all that pollution. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. I mean, we are breathing the cleanest air humans have ever breathed because of the Clean Air Act. And we thought we were making so much progress. You know, toxic sprays that hurt the ozone layer, knowledge of the greenhouse effect in the 80s and how it was warming the planet, which we made the models and predictions then that have held almost till today. Now we're exceeding those models, but you know, we did all those things, and we were passionate about it. We just didn't see ExxonMobil coming along with their disinformation campaign, or the Koch brothers, or you know, the Murdoch media empire. You know, it just, and somehow, you know, we're losing this battle, and I just don't understand. I just don't understand how we're losing it. I noticed even in the voting in the UK or in the European Union lately, there's a shift to the right, and part of that is because of climate policies that people don't want to adhere to. And it's like, oh my gosh, it goes straight to my soul, you know.
Yeah.
I can understand migration and things like that, but the climate policies, do people not see? I thought when people saw what was going on around them, they would then believe our models, but they don't seem to. I don't get it. Well, one of those changes is so simple. It's eat something besides beef, because beef is by far the outlier. It's 10 times at least the water use and land use and greenhouse gases and deforestation and you know, de-wildlifing and everything else of any other kind of meat, except for maybe lamb. But we don't eat that much lamb anymore, I don't think. But you could still have chicken and fish and pigs if you're really, you know, into bacon. And so the current footprint of agriculture around the world is 4 billion hectares. I know it's hard to visualize, but the relative thing is the important thing. If we didn't eat beef, it would be 2 billion hectares.
Wow.
If we didn't eat dairy, it would be 1 billion hectares. So you could still eat the chicken and the fish, not the dairy, but the chicken and the fish and all the plants you wanted, and it'd only be 1 billion hectares, 1/4. We've deforested half the earth. When I gave my TEDx talk about this, I went on, I gave the talk with half a beard to symbolize the fact that, you know, we've deforested half the earth. 80% of the deforestation of the Amazon is coming from beef, for leather for our couches and car seats and for burgers. Well, go to Chick-fil-A instead of going to McDonald's and get a chicken sandwich instead of, I mean, I don't like the way chickens are treated any more than anyone, and all the pollution that it creates. And, you know, I'd rather they eat, you know, plants, because beef is, while it's 10 times the impact of pork or chicken or fish, it's 100 times the impact of plants. That you only get 3 calories out of beef for every 100 calories of plants you put in. And when people say, well, a lot of those plants aren't edible by humans anyway, like alfalfa. Yeah, we grow millions and millions of acres of alfalfa, which we wouldn't grow. Yeah, we can't eat the alfalfa, but we wouldn't grow it if it weren't for the beef. And so, I mean, it goes on, and there's all kinds of misinformation propagated by General Mills about, you know, it regenerates the soil more. No, just do a little bit of, watch one of my episodes about that.
I think one point to bring in too is that for something like beef, you have a lot of people pointing to grass-fed, quote unquote, regenerative beef. And I just want to make the point that we just don't have enough planet to do that well. For our global desire for meat just cannot be sustained on a way that's actually healthy for the environment or for the animals. So I hope that at least resonates with people to eat less.
Well, that famous General Mills report on White Oaks pastures, where they claim that it regenerates the soil, which is a dubious claim, because what White Oaks Pastures was doing was buying depleted land, overgrazed land, and then they were adding organic material to it for a couple of years, like hay and other organic materials. And so the soil was absorbing some carbon, but they also were buying feed at the feed store for the chickens and the pigs that they're releasing on the land because they're not really grazing animals. And it's that feed from the feed store that was supplementing the carbon. The cows that they're raising, they're getting, shipped to New York for a restaurant or to your neighborhood for McDonald's or something like that. That's carbon that's being removed. It's not the way the earth works with buffaloes and wolves. When a wolf kills a buffalo in Wyoming, they eat the buffalo and then they poop it out right there on the plains. The wolves don't ship it to New York for somebody to dine on. Mm-hmm. And they don't remove those buffalo from the land. So that White Oaks pasture thing is just fiction. But the one thing they had to admit is that grass-fed beef takes 2.5 times the land as stall-fed beef.
In episode 16, I chatted with law-trained nutrition PhD, Dr. Alan Flanagan, about scholarly consensus in nutrition and where plant foods come into that, the nutritional considerations of consuming red meat, spotting red flags on social media, and much more.
I would say broadly, and then in a more dietary pattern sense. So I've kind of singled out particular food groups and nutrients. I think at the level of dietary patterns, we've got the basic kind of consensus, which has been the consensus in nutrition really since dietary guidelines formed, is that where the bulk of the diet is from plant sources of foods, whole grains, legumes, fruits, vegetables, that is a dietary pattern that is broadly conducive to health and lower disease risk.
What can you tell us about red meat in terms of its nutritional impact or profile? As far as I think some people would be like, well, if it's bad for the environment, but really good for my health, then how do I square that? And I'm not trying to pigeonhole or shoehorn something into this must align with our environmental data. But I'm curious for our listeners to hear, what do we need to know about the health impacts of the largest emitter?
Yeah, so we typically would stratify red meat according to whether it's processed or unprocessed. Now, for processed meat in particular, we now have pretty convincing evidence, and again, consensus in regard to processed meat, that high amounts, which would be defined as about over 50 grams a day, which is not a huge amount at all, so relatively small amounts of processed meat consumed regularly over time are associated with significantly higher colorectal cancer risk, several other kind of specific cancer site outcomes, and cardiovascular disease risk and type 2 diabetes risk. So I think we could really kind of, at this point, have a fair degree of consensus in relation to the role of processed meat. Where things have been more debated is in relation to unprocessed, or what we might call fresh meat. So this is, a fillet steak that has not been, salted, cured, or anything, that someone is buying fresh and is, cooking, possibly in the home or whatever. And this has been a little trickier for several reasons. One of which is that a general characteristic of looking at nutrition research is typically nothing exists in a vacuum. No food in and of itself as a result of its nutritional profile, because we do need nutrients for life. There's no food that just because of the nature of the food or the name of the food is inherently harmful. There's no such thing as a nutrient. Like I mentioned sodium earlier. Sodium's not inherently harmful. We require it. We just require very, modest amounts to be obtained endogenous or from the diet. And we have endogenously very tightly regulated systems in the body to preserve whatever sodium we have. So no nutrient in a saturated fat. Saturated fat is not in and of itself harmful, but at certain thresholds of intake, if it constitutes, a large proportion of someone's daily energy, then it's a problem. And the same principle applies to specific foods. And this is where kind of I think people get wrong when they hear that a food is adversely associated with health outcomes or may increase risk of X, Y, Z. And you'll hear people kind of make these kind of naturalistic fallacy arguments. Like, oh, how could something natural be be bad for you, so to speak. Well, it's not that it in and of itself is harmful. It's that at certain thresholds of intake, there is a risk. And it is the case with unprocessed red meat. Some of the inconsistency in the evidence actually reflects the fact that in some populations, they don't actually have particularly high levels of red meat consumption. So if you've got a cohort study of Japanese participants and you're looking at the association between red meat and cardiovascular disease in that cohort, you may not find anything. But when you look at their average levels of red meat intake, the highest level of intake in that group might be like 70 grams a day. It's not a particularly large amount. If you look at the North American cohorts on red meat intake, we consistently see risk related to multiple cardiometabolic and cancer outcomes. But the thresholds of intake in the highest group, highest kind of categories of meat consumers is over 180 grams a day. Factoring in underestimation, that typically is the case with observational dietary assessments, people are likely consuming more than that, over 200 grams plus a day. So at those levels of intake, and then if you take those thresholds and you start to say, okay, what happens if we think about the relationship with this, with red meat and these thresholds, and you look at European populations, you can see the same associations present themselves at those thresholds. So I think at this point, we can say that individuals consuming high red meat diets, which are now very vogue on social media, these are not benign. It doesn't matter that they're not processed meats. There are other mechanisms by which high levels of unprocessed meat would relate to risks, such as the heme iron content, the formation of N-nitroso compounds that interact with that heme iron in the gastrointestinal tract, and potentially cooking methods that have a role as well. It does have, obviously, for fattier cuts, the saturated fat content, etc. So I think at this point, when we are a little more refined with how we parse that literature and resolve some of the apparent inconsistencies, we can see that there is a relationship. There probably isn't at under 100 grams a day, but that's typically not what people in these kind of like meat emphasizing diets are eating, because less than 100 grams a day is a fairly minuscule, it's an amount of meat that's probably the size of kind of like the palm of your hand. And so, again, where someone consuming a high meat diet, then there's both of those considerations enter the fray. You've got the environmental footprint of consistently consuming, over 200 grams of red meat a day, every day. And then you've got the potential, health implications of that kind of dietary pattern over time.
Like you're saying, we don't live in a vacuum. We don't eat in a vacuum. If you're not eating this, you're eating more of that, and vice versa. So if you're choosing to eat more red meat, then you're probably eating less legumes and whole grains and non-starchy vegetables, etc. Whereas if you're emphasizing more of those plant foods rich in fiber and polyphenols and whatnot, then you're going to get those benefits while you're also reducing the intake of those, the heme iron and et cetera, that could be harmful on the other side.
Yes. And so you've raised a really important principle in relation to nutrition research generally and how we actually go about doing some of these analyses, which is that it inherently, because we need a certain amount of energy to live, no one's gonna, if you stop eating one food or you reduce an amount of a food, there is always going to be a replacement effect, because otherwise people would just be, deciding to have a bunch of foods out of their diet or completely exclude them. And maybe, suddenly they're eating, 600-700 less calories a day or whatever. They're going to want to make up that energy. So there's always this implication of, if someone's choosing to reduce food A and exclude entirely food B, they're going to be replacing those with food C and D. And those replacement effects or those substitution effects are actually crucial in determining the long-term health kind of outcomes of specific foods and diets. And generally speaking, across the board, especially when it would come to foods like red meat, like I don't think I've seen a substitution analysis where red meat has been modeled as being replaced by, a legume or whole grain or not, vegetables, and the vegetables are not associated, or the whole grains or the plant food are not associated with lower risk. So there's generally this kind of like net benefit to lowering high levels of, for individuals consuming high levels of red meat, there's generally net benefits to that reduction.
I recall hearing you share during a conversation that you had with Simon Hill and Drew Harrisberg that the environmental impact of food plays a role in how you personally decide to eat. And with an education in nutrition, I would imagine that nutritional factors are likely the primary decision-making factor for you in your day-to-day food choices. But could you speak a little bit to the role that environmental factors play for your own food choices?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, you mentioned our world in data a few minutes ago, and I think when you see data like that, a part of the conversation with Drew and Simon at the time that I probably didn't articulate particularly well on that podcast because I think we were about 3 hours in and my brain was starting to leak out of my ears. Well, but part of what we were discussing, kind of even offline, was the idea because Drew had basically said to me along the lines of, do you not find the kind of ethical aspects to this far more persuasive? And my response was no, because there's you're wading into the realm of moral philosophy and various kind of frameworks we're considering. And I know that, there's very persuasive arguments in that respect. But if you're asking me what's easier to look at and have a kind of an immediate sense of this is something I can action, I mean, a data-driven chart, like the ones you would see on something like Our World in Data, is far more immediate and persuasive to me than the wrangling of kind of philosophical kind of arguments around ethical frameworks and kind of the morality related to eating. So that is something that very much kind of jumped out at me. I was already probably 5, 6, 7 years ago starting to make transitions in my own diet that were very much more related to nutritional factors. Like they were the driving decision. Like I was deliberately starting to eat more legumes, for example, on a day-to-day basis because I was like, shit, like this research, like me an idiot. And partly like, I wasn't from a country and a culture that like in Ireland, I mean, oats is as good as it gets as far as us, we're not a population that like lentils are, kind of sitting there as part of the kind of the cultural meal plan. And so, this was as much a kind of a culinary experiment for me as well. I was kind of enjoying, I'd eaten fairly repetitive diet for kind of sports and training, and I'd kind of gotten sick of that. I'd been doing that for most of my 20s, and I was kind of over that kind of you're eating to fuel. And I was kind of like, I'm kind of over that now. I'd like to actually enjoy what I'm eating.
Yeah.
Um, so that was a part of it, but very much nutritionally driven. Like, oh, I should really be upping my fiber intake. What foods will help me get there? Okay, cool. So those kind of decisions are starting to like shape a change in my diet. And then really, I do think that for certain foods, I never would have eaten particularly high daily amounts of red meat. But I would have eaten much higher daily amounts of white meats. And even at that, I was kind of looking at this going, well, this is pretty consistent. Okay, red meat's particularly beef is particularly deleterious environmentally. But actually, if you go down through almost every source of kind of, animal-based protein, then you're kind of into like it's kind of staring you in the face as the greenhouse gas emission footprint, the land use, the wider impacts kind of environmentally in terms of runoff and all of this kind of coalesces together, which to me was a particularly persuasive argument for a further adjustment that wasn't just thinking about the nutritional aspects of the diet and was actually starting to think about how are those individual choices I'm making adding up.
If you don't mind switching over to the social media conversation that we've been
Yeah.
holding the door back on, I imagine that you would agree that it's unfortunate these days that so many people are relying on social media and YouTube for their nutrition advice. I also know that you have a thorough list of red flags for spotting quacks So,
Yeah.
are there any highlights that you'd like to share with our listeners in terms of how they can guard from falling prey to nutrition quacks?
Yes. So actually, we now have some really low-hanging fruit. If they have taken any aspect of their clothes off, I think that's a good place to start. If they've taken clothes off and have walked into a supermarket, that's just a hard pass. If they've taken clothes off, walked into a supermarket and are shouting at vegetables and other generally accepted healthy foods, then that's a major hall pass. Um, and yeah, so behavior, I think, on social media is a really kind of important cue. And then there's things like making absolute statements. Like no one in science, no one in research makes absolutist statements. Like even going back to some of the topics we've discussed today, like I could have said, yeah, unprocessed red meat will kill you. Like, but that's not the answer, right? The answer is that, like, hey, we've got risk at these thresholds. We might not see risk at these thresholds, and that's the answer. That doesn't do well on social media. Um, so absolutist statements to me is always a red flag. And communicating the way that people interact as well. If you come across a new page, and maybe it's not necessarily immediately having any of these aesthetic warnings, so to speak, the kind of presentation warnings that you might get, and they appear convincing as to whatever their narrative might be. A good litmus test, I think, is always to actually probe an individual. And I say this to people a lot. Ask a question. Oh, what evidence supports this claim? How does that evidence support this claim? You don't have to be an expert to ask that question. No one has to be an expert to ask that question. How they respond will typically give the game away. There is far more consensus than controversy. And if you're in a place where you think nutrition's all controversy and contention, then possibly spending too much time online. What I like about the plant-based meat alternatives is that they give you the space to, like, you could, for example, like you could take a chicken curry recipe and you could easily just substitute, say, the tofu for the chicken, right? But it does give you that scope as well. Like the corn mince, for example, is great if you, like, in winter you want something like a kind of shepherd's pie or a cottage pie or something that's kind of like quite, warming and wintry. And it just takes there's slight differences in like cooking. Like if you're cooking with that kind of mince, it tends to like hold a bit of water more. So if you have like a recipe that involves, say, adding like a kind of a chili sauce or something that you've made, you need to add less sauce because that there will be some moisture from the mince that it cooks in the pan. So otherwise it'll be too watery if you add. But like once you get around those little quirks to using it, you can really recreate without any sort of compromise the kind of texture and stuff that you would if you were making like a chili, like a kind of minced chili. So they've provided a great scope for people. I think they've made it very easy to be able to have, and particularly for me, because I still do, train, is quite kind of regularly. And I would still always have a kind of radar for like making sure I'm getting enough protein. And that can be something that when people do start like replacing a lot of, kind of easier sources of plant protein or sorry, animal source protein with plant sources of protein, that they can often, and I do appreciate this, be kind of, well, where am I going to get my protein from? There are, of course, multiple ways that you can do that. But these products do make it very helpful for people to kind of have that additive effect on top of, tofu or tempeh or other kind of, paneer if someone eats it and stuff like that.
Soy was the main focus of episode 20 with Dr. Matthew Nagra, a naturopathic doctor from British Columbia who dedicates a significant amount of time to staying up on the scientific literature and myth-busting through his well-tailored response videos online. Given that soy is a topic often shrouded with confusion, we discussed the biggest myths about soy, health outcomes related to soy consumption, and soy food's versatility and nutritional composition. One of the first podcast interviews of yours that I ever encountered focused on soy, and it was probably one of your episodes with Simon Hill on the proof. And I honestly think I may have you to thank for giving me the confidence to embrace soy foods, because I was definitely under this like umbrella of myths before that point. And I imagine that many listeners are still living under the shadow of many of those myths that have circulated about soy. So, given that soy foods can be a great source of protein, among other things, and they have a low carbon footprint, I'm curious to hear you share what are the most common myths that you tend to run up against with regard to soy, and what does the science say about soy consumption?
The biggest misconception is that soy foods are estrogenic or they have estrogenic properties. And then that leads into other misconceptions like it increases risk of breast cancer. So I think let's tackle the first part around them just being estrogenic in the first place. So soy contains these types of flavonoids. Flavonoids are like a class of these compounds that we'll find in a variety of foods, especially in the plant kingdom, and they can have different properties like anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, et cetera. And there's a certain class of them called isoflavones, which are also referred to as phytoestrogens. So when people hear that, obviously they link to estrogen. And the reason they have that term is that if you look at their structures side by side, I know this is an audio interview, but basically there's a part of the structure of that chemical compound that is similar to estrogen, but it's not the same compound. They are clearly different if you were to look at images. And there's different kinds of phytoestrogens, but they all generally share at least some characteristics with the estrogens that we produce in our body. And because of those structural similarities, they can bind to some of the same receptors in our body that estrogen does, and thereby having some type of estrogenic effect. So people take that to mean that, well, it's going to be pro-estrogenic. Well, the problem is that they specifically bind to certain types of receptors. They don't just bind to all of them, and they don't bind as strongly as our own estrogens do. And so the types of receptors that they bind to, known as the beta receptors, these ones have anti-estrogenic properties in our breast tissue. So a pro-estrogenic response would potentially increase risk of breast cancer, but an anti-estrogenic response would potentially do the opposite. And we'll get to that data in a little bit, what actually happens. In bone tissue, those receptors have pro-estrogenic effects, which is a good thing. That helps maintain bone mineral density, and that's one of the reasons that in like postmenopause, women are at higher risk of fracture and reducing bone mineral density. So just based on speculation around that, we can actually expect good results from soy as it pertains to hormones. But there's a couple other cases or areas where we see these concerns arise. So one of them is that there is research done in rodents where they'll give them these phytoestrogens and they'll run into issues. They'll maybe develop cancer, have other hormonal effects. But there's a couple problems there. For one, we aren't rodents, and there is actually research suggesting that we metabolize these phytoestrogens differently than rodents do. And the other problem is they give them just ridiculous doses. If you were to extrapolate that to our body size, like it would be more than you could ever consume in a day. And a lot of the time, or I don't know actually if it's the majority or not, but in a number of cases, they actually inject them as well. So it's not oral consumption. So there's a bunch of issues with extrapolating that data to humans. There are, however, a couple case studies. So these were individual cases of men who were consuming in the ballpark of, I think it was as low as 12 to as high as about 20 servings of soy a day. And so this is a ridiculously high intake, higher than I would ever recommend, not for fear of estrogenic effects or anything like that, but even just on the basis of, well, you're not eating a varied diet in that respect. And they did run into some problems. So one of them was having struggling with erectile dysfunction. Another one noted some breast tissue growth, but it's not clear if it was due to the soy or not. It could be, because that was obviously a factor. But it could be due to the fact that they just had a really poor diet overall, as far as quality, or it could be non-diet related as well. We can't rule that out. Nonetheless, even if we were to accept that it was the soy, it's a ridiculous amount. So we don't really have to worry about that. What would be better to look at are randomized controlled trials done in humans. So you take a group of people, you split them in half get soy, half get some other food or a placebo. If they're doing them in like pill form, they might do the phytoestrogens in pill form versus a placebo. And in those cases, we have meta-analyses of dozens of trials now, both in men and in women. And you don't see any clinically significant, clinically meaningful effects in men or women as far as testosterone or estrogen levels. And the limited evidence we have actually looking at things like fertility, erectile function, menstrual cycle, regularity or length, we don't see any concerning results. And these are studies that go up to, on the high end, like 5-ish servings a day. So up to that point, at least, we can be pretty confident that in adults, there aren't any major concerns. In kids, there's less data, but there's still data up to a few servings a day. And again, we don't see any real concerns. So based on the highest quality data by far, so not done in rodents and not just individual cases where they're having ridiculous doses, we see that soy consumption doesn't have any meaningful effect on hormone levels. And as you noted, it's a great source of protein. It's overall a great source of nutrition. And we do have studies comparing soy protein to even whey protein, which is considered like the gold standard, suggesting that it promotes similar muscle and strength gains as well. So that's actually a good reason to be consuming those foods. Diving into some health outcomes, like breast cancer is the big one. And as I noted, as far as breast tissue, the phytoestrogens, if anything, likely have an anti-estrogenic effect. And when we follow people who consume soy over long periods of time, compared to those who don't eat soy or consume very little soy, those who consume more actually have a lower risk of developing breast cancer. And in breast cancer survivors, there are at least a small handful of studies on this. It reduces the risk of recurrence or death in those with previous breast cancer diagnoses. So if anything, it's beneficial. And this is recognized by the American Cancer Society, the Canadian Cancer Society. They actually have notes about soy in there. They aren't saying that it's clearly going to like absolutely reduce your risk, but what they say is that there isn't any good evidence of harm, and the overall balance of evidence suggests benefit. So, so not a reason to shy away. If anything, a reason to possibly include some in those cases. And then as far as men, I mean, there is some research on prostate cancer risk, possibly reducing risk, and those results are most clear when replacing dairy with soy. So replacing, say, dairy milk with soy milk, because dairy is associated with a higher risk. So that is potentially a good swap. And there were a couple large reviews that were published within the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years, 2 separate reviews that looked at a number of health outcomes. And there were reductions in risk of a number of cancers, reductions in risk of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, based on the balance of evidence. And there were no real harms. I think one thing worth noting is just the nutritional content. So it is, for one, it's super versatile. I mean, you can use it in so many different ways. Obviously, tofu, tempeh, edamame. I mean, it's used in things like soy sauces, and it can be the oil. It can be used in so many different ways. So that's one positive. And then second, as far as nutritional composition, if we look at something like tofu or even whole soybeans, they're one of the higher protein legume sources or protein sources amongst the legumes. And they're typically rich in calcium compared to other legumes. They can provide some iron. They can be great sources of fiber. Tofu, not as much because some of the fiber is removed, but at least with the whole soy, it's just all around one of the probably healthiest and most nutritious legumes, at least healthiest based on the fact that we have the most like solid data on it at this point. And it's just really a shame that it gets fear-mongered over so much in that respect. Soy actually has a very balanced amino acid profile, more similar to what you would get from meats typically. So it is a really, really good option in that sense. And like I said earlier, we have research comparing soy protein to even whey protein, and you get similar outcomes at the end of the day. So there doesn't seem to be an advantage to whey over soy or vice versa.
Only last week, I shared episode 35 with Dr. Sandra Richter, an Old Testament scholar who is also a sought-out speaker and writer on the topic of environmentalism. Dr. Richter and I discussed the concept of stewardship, care for the environment, the unfortunate politicization of this issue, and much more. Taking our cues from Genesis, and for the person that is maybe still scratching their head because they haven't read Stewards of Eden yet, they haven't heard you speak, what's the appeal to stewardship?
Yeah. Great question. So taking that core idea that we as people of faith care about the environment or feel a responsibility to steward the environment because God cares about the environment and God gave us this task of stewarding this planet and all of the majestic ecosystems that inhabit it. Where does that idea come from? And as you have just flagged, that idea starts in the very beginning. And in the blueprint of creation, which is offered to us in the creation narratives of Genesis 1 and 2, what we see is this very firm declaration that humanity is unique in creation because we alone bear the image of God. And as God's image bearers, we're given a unique level of authority and a unique level of responsibility regarding creation. So when we look at Genesis 1 in particular, we see that the planet, the creation of the planet is being offered to us in terms of a perfect week. And so we have this 7-day structure. And there are many things people do with this 7-day structure, but I believe that a core idea that the biblical author is offering us is who's in charge here and where does everything go? So you look at day 1, 2, and 3, and you see the creation of 3 specific habitats. We have day and night, we have sea and sky, and we have dry land. When we circle back to 4, 5, and 6, we see that the inhabitants of those realms are now created. So for day and night on day 1, sun, moon, and stars are created on day 4. So for sea and sky on day 2, its parallel is day 5 when the fish and the birds are created. And then day 3, the dry land, its parallel is 6a, which is the land animals. And then you get to 6b, which launches about Genesis 1:26. And it doesn't take a literary expert to recognize that this is the apex of the piece. This is where all the verbiage is. This is where, if this is a symphony, this is where all the percussion comes in, And it's at this moment that humanity is created, and the creator turns to the human being, male and female, created in his image, and he gives them dominion and rule over all that has come before. So the pattern in Genesis 1 is this pattern of authority. First of all, who goes where, and then who's in charge of what. And so humanity is now set over all of the spaces and the creatures that have come before. But as we all know, the week isn't over until we get to day 7. And day 7 is when the Almighty is enthroned over all he has created. And he is the ultimate authority figure over all. So it's in Genesis 1, very specifically, we hear and learn that humanity has been created a steward of this amazing planet that we've been given. And humanity's stewardship is designed to be a reflection of God's sovereignty. So God rules, and then we've been placed just under to execute his rule on this planet. That's the blueprint. And that blueprint is reiterated all the way throughout our Bibles, and it is restored in the new heavens and the new earth. When we get to Genesis 2, there's a little more specificity about what that stewardship looks like. And in Genesis 2:15, we read that God placed the human in the garden, and the garden is a microcosm for the entire planet. God placed the human in the garden. We could even read that God installed the human in the garden in order to tend it and to protect it. So this is the commission that is handed to humanity from the beginning of time. And what I do in the book and what I do in my lectures is I help people see that original commission of humanity as steward of this planet with authority. I mean, humanity's got dominion. A lot of environmentalists don't like to use that word. We do have dominion. But that dominion is under the authority of the Almighty. So we are to rule as we have been ruled. We are to communicate with our lives the value system of the Creator.
Coming back to this idea of dominion, I think I wanted to chat a little bit about, what do you think we get wrong here? And I think part of what I'm already seeing is that it's just been stripped of this context.
Mm-hmm. And yes, very much. And I think there are multiple causes for that. And a major one is politics, and specifically American politics, that the traditional champions of environmental concern are not the traditional champions of the church politically. So in our dual party system, and especially in our current context where polarization is the norm, polarization, villainization, and canceling is the norm, that the fact that environmentalism is seen in American politics as belonging to the Democratic Party, and the pro-life groups are on the Republican side, that there's this strange mental gymnastic where environmentalism has become non-Christian by default, because in our practice, it's associated with the wrong party. And I think that we as Christians need to be extremely self-critical of how much we allow the political systems of this world to invade the political system of the world we're actually called to be a citizen of. And I will say often to groups that we're citizens of another kingdom here, and neither party of American politics are ever going to satisfy the moral code of the Almighty. When we eat, we are, of course, flexing our credit cards to make the capitalist system we know and love as the American economy function. And I just want to put in my plug that sometimes the most important thing we can do as stewards of this planet is think about what we buy and why we buy it. And when it comes to food in particular, we can leverage this capitalist system, which is not perfect, but it's what we've got, toward the humane, toward the sustainable, toward the organic. It's interesting to me that one of the biggest impacts we can have on environmental concerns comes out of our economy. And we talked about how the Christian world sometimes doesn't value environmentalism because they're so focused on the conversion of souls, right? Well, the capitalist often doesn't care for the environment because they're so focused on making money, right? And those value systems impinge on good environmental stewardship.
Finally, 2024 also brought an opportunity for me to consider the work I'm doing with Eating for Eden and Eden and Me through the lens of my doctoral work on beauty, epistemology, and theology. Here's a snippet from episode 23, Taste and See, How Beauty Can Change Our Diets, which explores the potential role for beauty in inspiring our taste buds toward changes for good. The ideas in this episode are something I'd like to continue to explore in 2025, both through this podcast and, of course, through continuing to offer beautiful, delicious recipes on edenandme.com. When I was in college, I recall bringing a smoothie with me to class one day. Seated, as was my custom, in the front row, my professor had a clear view of my bright green snack prominently visible in a glass jar. "That looks healthy," he said. Aesthetics at work, and with a telling outcome. How I responded is of little consequence. What stood out to me then, and sticks with me still now, was not only the words he used, but the way he said them. "That looks healthy." Can you hear it? What he said, and how he said it, communicated that healthy and delicious were factors that could not coexist. In his mind, one necessarily ruled out the other. Unfortunately, this seems to be the prevailing mindset in a large swath of the general population. The beauty of delight and pleasure in food is presumed to be categorically separate from that which is healthful for the body. What results is a widely assumed dichotomy of pleasurable taste and healthfulness in food. I would like to challenge this notion. Healthy food can be delicious. In fact, I think we owe it to ourselves and others to make healthy food delicious. These are not mutually exclusive. Going one better, to health and taste, I'd like to add in a third factor, which should be no surprise given this podcast: environmental concern. These three can and should go together. What scientific research shows is healthy for the body and good for the environment can also be wildly pleasurable to eat. Aesthetic experience and scientific evidence can align, and for the health and enjoyment of all, they must. The trouble is, how does one communicate such a thing in a way that will bring about a meaningful and lasting response? In other words, how do we get people to join together two things they've long held at odds? How do we get them to see that what is good for the body and the planet is also able to delight our senses? In a word, we must show them. Beauty is the path we must take. Hang with me, I will unpack why that is the case. A friend recently shared a New York Times Magazine article with me, which expressed a reality all too true in our society today. As much as we learn about nutrition or environmental stewardship, we typically fail to make any meaningful or lasting changes to our dietary habits. We learn that high levels of saturated fat increase LDL cholesterol, that excess sodium can lead to hypertension, and that processed meats are categorized as Class 1 carcinogens. And yet we continue to enjoy our bacon and eggs without batting an eye. We learn about the massive contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, land use, and eutrophication that animal agriculture is responsible for, and cows in particular. Yet we sit down to our steak, hamburgers, and roast dinners week in, week out. What this article was emphasizing is that we don't fail to make changes for lack of information. There's plenty of that to go around. And even though the presence of charlatans on social media means that misinformation and disinformation abound, there is scientific consensus about common, broad brushstroke characteristics of dietary patterns that are best for human and planetary health. In short, we know what we should be eating. Less saturated fat. More whole grains and legumes. Less highly processed foods. More whole plants, especially colorful fruits and vegetables. Less red meat, more plant protein, and the list goes on. As Michael Pollan has encapsulated in his pithy dictum, we should eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Why is it that we follow such simple advice so poorly? Back to that New York Times Magazine article, while reading it, the author's message hit me like a slap in the face. At once I saw the convergence of my current passion for food, nutrition, and environmentalism dovetail perfectly with my academic research on beauty and epistemology. The article's message? People won't change their eating habits based on information. They need to experience how delicious a new way of eating can be. In short, people need to taste and see. Beauty is what convinces, not data. Aesthetics, not logic. I don't mean to say that none of our decisions are made based on logic or upon reading the data. We can be and often are convinced by information. But when it comes to deeply held views and ingrained patterns, information is far less likely to make us budge than first-hand encounters with the beauty of a thing. The inspiration for this initial paper, and by extension this podcast episode, was the consideration of how to inspire people to make intrinsically motivated, meaningful, lasting changes to their dietary habits. Personal encounters with beautiful food can inspire action. Once your friend tastes that Mediterranean feast, his eyes will be open to the wonders to be found in whole plant foods that nourish his body and are conscious of the environment. Even if he doesn't make those logical connections to the broader values of bodily and planetary health, at least not yet, the nutritional and environmental impacts may come along as benefits in spite of him. He may simply begin to enjoy a greater amount and variety of healthy foods because he now can see how delicious they are and can be. This, at least, is the starting point. A movement in the right direction that can grow over time as beauty continues to do her work and logical understanding and assent follow in time. Well, that wraps up the highlights of 2024. It's been a great year. And thank you, dear listener, so much for your support during this first year of Eating for Eden. Before we finish, I want to tell you about a resource that I've created and am so excited to share. The Beginner's Guide to Plant-Based Eating is a 30-page ebook I developed with you in mind. I get a lot of questions about the real-life decisions involved in eating plant-based, such as how to make certain food swaps, where to get protein from plants, and even just what to eat in general. This guide walks you through essential guiding principles and exercises to build sustainable habits that will stick for the long term. Check out the link in the show notes to get your guide today. Also, be sure to tune in next week and the coming weeks because I'll be doing a short series of episodes focused on making progress over pursuing perfection. Since January is a time when many focus on making healthy changes, mini resets, or intentional habit formation, I'll be putting together some episodes to help guide you through making sustainable changes with regard to your food choices as they relate to planetary health. In the meantime, visit edenandme.com for recipes and check out the show notes for links to the full episodes that I took clips from for today's highlights. Have a very Merry Christmas, and I'll talk to you next week. Thanks for listening to Eating for Eden. If you found this episode informative or inspiring, please consider sharing it with a friend. Climate change is an issue we all need to tackle together, so let's invite others to journey along with us as we continue the conversation and start taking action. Until next week, friends, take care.